One of the greatest misconceptions about empathy is the belief that an empath's highest purpose is to save people. Many empaths spend years, sometimes decades, carrying this belief without ever questioning it. They become the listener, the fixer, the emotional caretaker, the person everyone calls when life falls apart. On the surface, this looks noble. In many cases, it is. But beneath that noble appearance often exists something far more complicated. The empath begins to build an identity around being needed. This is where the trap forms. When your sense of worth becomes tied to how much you can help, heal, or rescue others, you unknowingly place your value in someone else's dysfunction. Their problems become your purpose. Their chaos becomes your responsibility. Their healing becomes your mission. And because of this, you remain emotionally connected to situations long after wisdom would have told you to let go. Many empaths mistake self-sacrifice for love. Psychologically, this happens because highly sensitive individuals often develop an extraordinary awareness of other people's pain. They notice what others miss. They hear the sadness behind the smile. They sense the fear behind the anger. They recognize wounds that even the wounded person may not fully understand. Over time, they become convinced that because they can see the suffering, they are somehow responsible for removing it. But seeing pain and carrying pain are two completely different things. The Sophia stage begins when the empath finally understands this distinction. This realization rarely arrives through comfort. It usually arrives through disappointment. After enough betrayals, enough one-sided relationships, enough exhausting attempts to save people who refuse to save themselves, something begins to shift. The empath starts asking a dangerous question. What if helping everyone isn't actually helping anyone? That question changes everything. Because eventually, the empath notices a pattern. The people they rescue often repeat the same behaviors. The people they protect often refuse accountability. The people they carry often become dependent on being carried. What looked like compassion was sometimes enabling. What looked like kindness was sometimes fear. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being perceived as selfish. The Sophia empath confronts these uncomfortable truths directly. They begin to understand that growth cannot be given. It must be chosen. No amount of empathy can force transformation upon someone who is committed to remaining the same. No amount of love can create responsibility in a person who continually avoids it. This realization doesn't make the empath colder. It makes them wiser. There is a profound philosophical difference between compassion and rescue. Compassion says, I see your suffering. Rescue says, your suffering is now my responsibility. The Sophia empath chooses compassion. They learn to stand beside people rather than carrying them. They offer guidance without attachment to outcomes. They provide support without surrendering their own peace. Most importantly, they stop measuring their value by how much they can suffer for someone else. This is a difficult transition because many people benefited from the old version of the empath. Some will accuse them of changing. Some will say they have become distant. Others will claim they have become selfish. But what is actually happening is something much deeper. For the first time, the empath is establishing a boundary between what belongs to them and what belongs to others. And boundaries are often misunderstood by people who were benefiting from their absence. The Sophia stage is not the death of compassion. It is the death of unhealthy attachment. It is the moment an empath realizes that being available to everyone often means becoming unavailable to themselves. Once this realization takes root, a new kind of strength emerges. The empath no longer feels compelled to chase, convince, fix, or rescue. They understand that every human being has a journey that cannot be walked for them. And in accepting this truth, they discover something remarkable. The strongest form of love is not saving people from their lessons. The strongest form of love is respecting them enough to learn those lessons themselves. That is the moment the rescuer disappears, and wisdom finally takes its place. Once the empath releases the need to rescue everyone, something even more profound begins to happen. A new challenge emerges, one that many never fully master. It is the challenge of learning how to remain compassionate without becoming emotionally entangled. Most empaths spend the early part of their lives absorbing the emotional atmosphere around them. They walk into a room and immediately sense tension. They notice shifts in tone, facial expressions, body language, and unspoken emotions. Their awareness is so finely tuned that they often feel what others are feeling before those people can even articulate it themselves. At first, this sensitivity seems like a gift, and in many ways it is. But without boundaries, every gift eventually becomes a burden. The average empath doesn't simply recognize another person's emotions. They internalize them. Someone else's anxiety becomes their anxiety. Someone else's anger disrupts their peace. Someone else's sadness follows them home. Over time, they become emotional sponges, absorbing the psychological residue of everyone they encounter. The problem is that the human nervous system was never designed to carry the emotional weight of an entire world. This is why many empaths eventually reach a breaking point. They become exhausted without understanding why. They feel overwhelmed even when nothing appears wrong in their own lives. They carry stress that doesn't belong to them and wounds they never personally experienced. Then the Sophia Stage begins to reveal a difficult truth. Understanding someone's pain does not require becoming their pain. This distinction changes everything. The mature empath realizes that empathy and emotional fusion are not the same thing. In fact, they are often opposites. Emotional fusion occurs when the boundaries between self and others become blurred. The empath loses clarity about where another person's emotions end and their own begin. Wisdom restores those boundaries. The Sophia empath learns how to witness suffering without drowning in it. Imagine standing beside a river. Earlier in life, whenever someone struggled, the empath would jump into the water with them. If they were drowning, the empath would drown too. If they were panicking, the empath would panic as well. But eventually they realize something important. A drowning person cannot be helped by another drowning person. The Sophia empath remains on solid ground. They can still extend a hand. They can still offer guidance. They can still care deeply. But they no longer abandon themselves in the process. This emotional detachment is often misunderstood. People hear the word detachment and assume it means becoming cold, indifferent, or uncaring. It means none of those things. True detachment is not the absence of love. It is the absence of attachment to outcomes. It is the ability to care without controlling, to support without rescuing, to love without losing yourself. Psychologically, this represents an enormous leap in development. The empath is no longer reacting automatically to every emotional signal around them. Instead, they observe before absorbing. They evaluate before engaging. They choose consciously, rather than responding compulsively. This creates a remarkable sense of inner stability. For the first time, other people's emotions stop dictating the empath's emotional state. Chaos can exist around them without entering them. Criticism can be heard without becoming identity. Negativity can be witnessed without becoming contamination. People often notice this change immediately. Those who once relied on emotional manipulation become confused. Their guilt tactics no longer work. Their dramatic reactions no longer produce the same response. The empath remains calm where they once became reactive. This calmness can appear intimidating because most people are accustomed to influencing others through emotion. The Sophia empath cannot be easily influenced in this way anymore. Not because they care less, but because they finally care wisely. There is a profound philosophical principle hidden here. Compassion becomes most powerful when it is no longer driven by emotional dependency. When compassion is mixed with fear, guilt, or the need for approval, it loses clarity. But when compassion is grounded in self-awareness, it becomes something extraordinary. It becomes a conscious choice rather than an emotional reflex. And that is what separates the Sophia empath from those still trapped in earlier stages of comets. They have discovered that peace is not created by controlling the emotional weather around, and that peace is created by becoming stable enough to remain centered regardless of the weather. The moment you can stand in the presence of another person's storm without becoming the storm yourself, your empathy stops being a weakness and becomes a form of wisdom. Once an empath learns to stop rescuing everyone and develops the ability to remain compassionate without becoming emotionally entangled, a fascinating transformation begins to take place. Their awareness sharpens, their perception deepens, and what many people once called intuition starts evolving into something far more powerful. It becomes discernment. Most people use these two words interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Intuition is the ability to sense that something feels right or wrong. Discernment is the ability to understand why. Intuition whispers. Discernment explains. In the earlier stages of an empath's development, they often sense when something is off about a person or situation, but they struggle to trust themselves. They feel the inconsistency. They notice the subtle tension. They pick up on contradictions that others overlook. Yet because they naturally look for the good in people, they frequently dismiss their own observations. They give second chances, then third chances, then 10th chances. Not because they lack intelligence, but because compassion often causes them to search for explanations that preserve their belief in others. The Sophia Stage changes this completely. After years of experience, disappointment, healing, and self-reflection, the empath begins recognizing a fundamental truth about human behavior. Patterns rarely lie. Words can lie. Promises can lie. Appearances can lie. Intentions can even lie. But patterns tell the truth. The Sophia empath starts paying attention to what people consistently do rather than what they occasionally say. They understand that character reveals itself through repetition. A person's habits expose them far more accurately than their declarations ever will. This shift creates an entirely different way of seeing the world. Where others focus on isolated events, the Sophia empath notices systems of behavior. They begin connecting dots that most people never notice. They observe recurring cycles in relationships. They recognize familiar manipulation tactics. They see emotional strategies unfold before they reach their conclusion. This isn't magic. It isn't supernatural intuition. It's accumulated wisdom. Years of observing human behavior eventually create an internal database that operates almost automatically. The empath starts recognizing familiar patterns because they have encountered variations of them many times before. Psychologically, this is where emotional intelligence matures into psychological clarity. The Sophia empath becomes less interested in appearances and more interested in congruence. They stop asking, "What is this person saying?" and start asking, "Do their actions consistently support what they claim?" That single question eliminates an enormous amount of confusion. Because one of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming sincerity and integrity are the same thing. Someone can sound sincere while being completely unreliable. Someone can appear caring while consistently causing harm. Someone can express beautiful intentions while producing destructive outcomes. The Sophia empath learns to evaluate reality rather than narratives. This often surprises people, because empaths are frequently stereotyped as overly emotional. In truth, the most evolved empath becomes extraordinarily observant. Their compassion remains intact, but it is now balanced by reason. Their heart still functions, but it is no longer operating without the guidance of wisdom. As a result, manipulation becomes far less effective. Many forms of manipulation depend on creating emotional confusion. Guilt, blame-shifting, gaslighting, victim-playing, and emotional coercion all rely on disrupting a person's ability to see clearly. But clarity is difficult to manipulate. When an empath develops discernment, they stop reacting solely to emotional pressure. They start examining behavior objectively. They begin asking difficult questions. They become comfortable sitting with uncertainty until enough evidence reveals the truth. This patience is powerful. Most people rush toward conclusions because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. The Sophia empath develops the opposite skill. They learn to observe quietly and allow patterns to reveal themselves naturally. And eventually, they do. The result is a person who can see beneath surface appearances without becoming cynical. This distinction matters. Discernment is not suspicion. It is not paranoia. It is not assuming the worst about everyone. Discernment simply means seeing reality as it is instead of as you wish it to be. That requires courage, because reality does not always confirm our hopes. Sometimes it challenges them, but this challenge is precisely what creates wisdom. The Sophia empath understands that truth is not the enemy of compassion, Truth is what allows compassion to be directed wisely. Without discernment, empathy can be exploited. Without clarity, kindness can become vulnerability. But when compassion and discernment work together, something extraordinary emerges. You no longer become vulnerable to every story, every promise, or every performance. You learn to trust what people repeatedly reveal, rather than what they occasionally proclaim. And that is when intuition graduates into wisdom. Because the most powerful insight is not seeing what people say they are, but seeing what they consistently choose to be. As discernment deepens, another transformation begins to emerge, one that often surprises both the empath and the people around them. The empath, who once felt compelled to explain, justify, defend, and respond to everything, starts becoming quieter. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand the power of saying less. This is where the Sophia Stage becomes truly uncommon. Most people believe power comes from influence, persuasion, visibility, or control. They assume the strongest person in the room is the one speaking the most, asserting the most, or demanding the most attention. But the Sophia empath discovers something entirely different. They discover that power is often found in restraint. Earlier in life, many empaths feel an almost irresistible urge to correct misunderstandings. If someone misjudges them, they want to explain. If someone spreads false assumptions, they want to defend themselves. If someone interprets their intentions incorrectly, they feel compelled to provide clarification. This reaction is understandable. Human beings naturally want to be understood, but over time, the empath begins noticing something important. Not everyone misunderstands you because they lack information. Some people misunderstand you because they have already decided who you are. And no amount of explanation can change a conclusion that was never based on evidence in the first place. This realization is liberating. The Sophia empath stops wasting energy trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They recognize that explanation has limits. Communication requires two participants, one willing to speak honestly and another willing to listen honestly. Without both, explanation becomes performance. And performance is exhausting. Psychologically, this marks a major shift. The empath is no longer seeking validation through universal acceptance. They stop measuring their worth by how many people agree with them, approve of them, or understand them. Instead, they become anchored in something far more stable, their own clarity. This inner certainty creates a remarkable calmness. They no longer react immediately to criticism. They no longer rush to defend every accusation. They no longer feel obligated to participate in every conflict. Instead, they observe, they listen, they assess, and often they choose silence. Now, silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of strength. Many people assume silence is weakness because they associate it with surrender. But there is a profound difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from mastery. Fearful silence avoids confrontation. Masterful silence transcends unnecessary confrontation. The Sophia empath learns this distinction. They begin understanding that every response is an investment of energy. Every argument, every debate, every emotional reaction requires attention, focus, and psychological resources. And once they recognize energy as a finite resource, they become far more selective about where they spend it. This is where strategic presence enters the picture. The mature empath realizes that attention is one of the most valuable things a human being possesses. Wherever attention goes, energy follows. Wherever energy goes, life follows. So they become intentional. They stop giving attention to chaos simply because chaos is loud. They stop rewarding dysfunction with endless emotional engagement. They stop participating in conflicts that have no genuine desire for resolution. Instead, they invest their energy where growth is possible, where truth is valued, and where mutual respect exists. To many people, this shift feels unsettling. Those who once relied on emotional reactions suddenly encounter composure. Those who expected arguments encounter silence. Those who anticipated endless explanations encounter boundaries. And perhaps most surprising of all, those who took the empath's presence for granted begin to feel the impact of their absence. Because absence has a language of its own. The Sophia Empath understands that not every lesson requires words. Sometimes the most powerful statement is withdrawing energy from situations that no longer deserve it. Sometimes silence communicates what endless conversations never could. This is not punishment. It is alignment. It is the natural consequence of valuing one's own peace. Philosophically, this represents a profound evolution. Earlier stages of empathy are often driven by reaction. The Sophia stage is driven by intention. The empath is no longer controlled by external circumstances. They choose their responses deliberately, and that choice creates freedom. For the first time, they understand that they do not have to attend every conflict they are invited to. They do not have to defend every truth they know. They do not have to convince every skeptic or satisfy every critic. Their energy becomes sacred. Their attention becomes deliberate. Their presence becomes meaningful because it is no longer given automatically. And that is why the Sophia Empath often appears so powerful. It is not because they control others. It is because they have finally learned to control where they place their most valuable resource, their energy. The moment you stop giving your attention to everything that demands it, you create space for what truly deserves it, and that is where real power begins. When an empath reaches this point, when they no longer feel compelled to rescue everyone, when they can remain compassionate without becoming emotionally entangled, when discernment guides their perception and strategic silence protects their energy, something extraordinary begins to emerge. What emerges is inner sovereignty. This is the destination that so few people ever reach, not just empaths. It is one of the rarest forms of psychological development because it requires confronting some of the deepest fears that govern human behavior. The fear of rejection, the fear of abandonment, the fear of disapproval, the fear of being misunderstood. Most people spend their lives negotiating with these fears. They adjust their behavior to avoid criticism. They suppress their truth to maintain acceptance. They compromise their values to preserve relationships. They seek validation, because validation temporarily relieves uncertainty. The Sophia Empath eventually sees through this entire system. They begin to understand that much of human suffering comes from allowing external forces to define internal worth. This realization changes everything. Earlier in life, their emotional state may have risen and fallen based on how others responded to them. Praise felt like proof of value. Rejection felt like proof of inadequacy. Approval created confidence. Criticism created self-doubt. In other words, their identity remained connected to forces they could never fully control. And anything controlled by others can be manipulated by others. This is why inner sovereignty is so powerful. The sovereign empath no longer hands strangers the authority to determine their value. They stop outsourcing their self-worth to opinions, reactions, social acceptance, or external validation. Instead, they build their identity upon something far more stable: truth, not personal preference, not popularity, not public approval, truth. They ask themselves difficult questions. Are my actions aligned with my values? Am I acting with integrity? Am I living according to principles I genuinely believe in? Am I being honest with myself? Notice that none of these questions require permission from anyone else. This is what makes inner sovereignty so liberating. For perhaps the first time in their lives, the empath experiences psychological independence. They no longer need universal agreement to feel secure. They no longer need constant reassurance to trust themselves. They no longer need external confirmation to know who they are. And because of this, they become extraordinarily difficult to control. Many forms of manipulation operate through emotional leverage. Guilt works because someone fears disapproval. Intimidation works because someone fears consequences. Flattery works because someone craves validation. Shame works because someone doubts their worth. But what happens when those fears no longer govern a person? The leverage disappears. This is why the Sophia Empath is often described as dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of aggression, not dangerous in the sense of domination. They are dangerous because psychological control becomes ineffective. A manipulative person cannot easily influence someone who does not require their approval. A toxic person cannot easily destabilize someone who has learned emotional regulation. A dishonest person cannot easily confuse someone committed to truth. The sovereign empath possesses something that many people search for their entire lives and never find. An internal center, a place within themselves that remains stable, regardless of external circumstances. This does not mean life becomes easy. It does not mean they never feel pain. It does not mean disappointment disappears. The Sophia empath still experiences grief, loss, uncertainty, and heartbreak. They remain deeply human. The difference is that these experiences no longer define them. Pain becomes information rather than identity. Failure becomes feedback rather than condemnation. Rejection becomes redirection rather than destruction. Every challenge becomes part of growth rather than evidence of inadequacy. Philosophically, this is where empathy completes its evolution. Earlier stages are dominated by emotional sensitivity. The final stage is characterized by conscious wisdom. Compassion remains, but it is now balanced by boundaries. Love remains, but it is guided by discernment. Sensitivity remains, but it is anchored in strength. The empath no longer seeks power over others because they have discovered something far greater, power over themselves. And self-mastery is the foundation of every lasting form of freedom. This is the paradox that so many people miss. The most powerful empath is not the one who can feel the most. It is not the one who can heal the most people. It is not the one who receives the most admiration or recognition. The most powerful empath is the one who has become fully responsible for their own mind, their own emotions, their own energy, and their own life. That is the Sophia stage. And once a person reaches it, they stop asking the world for permission to become who they were meant to be. Because true freedom begins the moment your inner world is no longer governed by the opinions of the outer one.